The next panel is going to be talking about mining and regulation, which is extremely important because we need to get the regulation right in order to incentivize the most amount of mining in the US and anywhere that is trying to adopt Bitcoin mining. Our moderator is Susan Joseph. She's the executive director of FinTech at Cornell University. We also have Brian Morgenstern, and he is from Riot, which is one of the biggest public miners here in the United States. We have Tyler Williams, who's the head of regulatory and legislative affairs at Galaxy Digital, and Jayson Browder, who serves as the head of public policy at another massive miner, Marathon Digital. So I'll pass it to you, Susan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I'm happy to be here. Welcome. Good afternoon. I've already been introduced, so you don't need that part of me, other than my background is, in addition to executive director at FinTech at Cornell, is I'm also a lawyer and a consultant. And P.S., I love Bitcoin. A couple of housekeeping rules. Since I am a lawyer, I have to say this is not legal or an investment advice. And to my panelists, if you use acronyms or terms that the industry doesn't know, jargon, I'm going to stop you and ask you to define it. So with that, let's just say we are very fortunate to have the 3 largest mining companies today who are very much involved with Bitcoin mining regulation. Miners have faced a lot over the years and are sometimes viewed as an easy target. Regulatory focus ranges from climate to anti-money laundering, and now we have this recent new category called public harm, which was what was referred to with Senator Lummis on the Energy Information Administration survey that was hastily put out and thankfully quashed by regulation. So those on the panel know that it's a vigilant task, ever vigilant. But we also know, and as everybody probably in this room knows, crypto isn't going away, and it in fact is growing. I looked at a few statistics. They might be different from what you heard this morning. 2023 Coinbase survey said 20% of Americans own crypto. This being DC and an election year, it's important to note that crypto is bipartisan. Equal numbers of Democrats and Republicans own crypto, independents as well. This is a generational shift. Gen Z and millennials, whether or not they own crypto, believe that crypto and blockchain is the future. 2024 Cryptocurrency Adoption and Sentiment Report estimated before the Bitcoin ETF that 29 million new users would be added. Well, guess what? As of March 1st, the Bitcoin ETFs own 4% of all Bitcoin. One can imagine that 29 million number was hit and exceeded. So now I'm going to turn to our panel. I'm going to ask each of you to give yourselves a 2-sentence introduction. Then we're going to proceed to a level set just so that everybody knows what Bitcoin mining is. Brian is going to do this. The rest of you can jump in. We'll move on to the issues. And at the end, I have a flash round where I'm going to ask you each to give me a 1-sentence takeaway, what you want this audience to understand from this panel. So let's start with intros.
Hi, everybody. I'm Brian Morgenstern, head of public policy for Riot Platforms, leading our advocacy efforts at the federal and state level. I previously served in government at the U.S. Treasury Department and at the White House, as well as on Capitol Hill earlier in my career. Also, like Susan, am a lawyer and lover of Bitcoin.
Hi, everyone. Jayson Browder, head of public policy for Marathon Digital Holdings. I also lead our federal advocacy and state relations efforts. Marathon in particular is very focused on our international expansion with sites in the UAE, a partnership with their sovereign wealth fund, ADQ, and then most recently in Paraguay. And so I also support our international efforts, working very closely with our U.S. government partners at both Commerce and State Department, and then the Foreign Service officers at Post.
Pleasure to be with you all. Tyler Williams. I'm the head of public policy at Galaxy Digital. We are a diversified financial services company in the digital asset ecosystem. Like Brian, I am a lawyer, but not practicing one here. And also an expat of the government, having served in the Treasury Department and the House and the Senate.
Thank you all. Okay, Brian, I'm going to ask you to give a quick, maybe 5-minute max introduction to Bitcoin mining as a level set for those so make sure we're all on the same page.
Sure. So Riot Platforms, we operate in Texas, and we run Bitcoin mining data centers. And that's what they look like, data centers. They're, imagine, football field long buildings with racks or tanks of computers, and they're hashing. And one of the best illustrations I can give you is sort of with the halving every 4 years, the series of letters and numbers gets a little shorter and a little shorter. The miners are the ones doing that hashing, unlocking the keys to the next block in the blockchain, and all those transactions that come with each block, all the timestamps and addresses denoting this new Bitcoin is entered into circulation, or it's transferred from this address to this address. It's really the security function, security software provider for this decentralized network. And it's secured by computers, tens of thousands all over the world. And that brings me to sort of the tie-in with regulation and some of the biggest issues that we've found. A network that is decentralized, and it is a peer-to-peer network secured by all these computers all over the world, that sort of makes a lot of people here in Washington, the center of power, of course, very uncomfortable because it sort of threatens the status quo, it threatens the regime that they're very familiar with. And so if people are not comfortable with a decentralized network existing, then they may test its mettle by coming after it in a variety of different ways. One was a year ago when the bank regulators issued some advisories telling banks that digital asset companies, if you have them as customers, that could pose challenges to your safety and soundness as a financial institution. That led to a lot of large companies. You may be mining Bitcoin, but you may be paying your construction workers and your engineers or your public policy staff in US dollars. So you probably have a lot of cash, but banks hearing from the regulators that a Bitcoin mining data center company might pose threats to safety and soundness, were actually sort of getting a little bit uneasy with holding the cash of companies like ours, of Bitcoin miners. So that was one sort of, now I think we weathered that storm, but that's one regulatory hurdle. Another is the AML KYC. Of course, a decentralized network means that you don't necessarily have banks keeping all the information of all the customers. A Bitcoin miner is not custodying any assets of customers. Therefore, there's some unease, a little tension between what I think is the financial model of the future and the existing one. So there's some growing pains in terms of how do you adapt the AML KYC framework that exists onto what's going to happen, or what is happening now and what's going to happen in the future. Another is the energy point that Susan raised. And I think there's a big raging debate over is the use of power by Bitcoin data centers a worthy use of power, because we're probably going to have to, we just heard in another talk, maybe double our generation and transmission capabilities in the United States to meet the needs of the economy of the future. And so there's skepticism over an energy-intensive business. Oh, is that a good use of energy? But that brings us to a scarcity versus abundance argument. And one point I think I'll want to make sure everybody leaves this room with is that Bitcoin miners are flexible loads, which means, yes, they consume energy, but they don't consume scarce energy. So when we're getting near peak demand, Bitcoin miners are curtailing or participating in demand response programs. It's actually part of the business model. And we just heard in the previous talk about how we can incentivize new generation. That's a great thing. So I've gone a little bit out of scope, but I wanted to introduce
And the panel is done.
I was going to say,
Very good, thanks.
some of those key topics.
I was going to say you didn't leave much room for us to give anything there.
Sorry, please, by all means.
Yeah, I would like you guys to jump in. I know one of the questions was, what are the top policy issues for today moving forward? So
Maybe
You
I'll
guys
jump
wanna
in there.
jump in
So
on
I
that?
think Brian did a great job of like giving the specifics. I think in Washington, the problem that you have in the regulatory and legislative world is that we have these vectors of risk, and that's how policymakers they make decisions about what to do. And it's usually a layered approach onto the existing regulatory or legislative framework. So we find ourselves in this situation where one of my colleagues, he was talking about the problem about the Bank Secrecy Act, and I think back that we got two things out of the Nixon administration. We got the EPA and we got the Bank Secrecy Act, and we're both left dealing with these issues today. So we have this problem where there's a little bit of, because of the inertia that's behind the existing regulatory and legislative frameworks, we find ourselves in a situation where the receptivity for innovative approaches or new things and new ideas is really hard, and it's a lot of work in the education side of things and just explaining what it is. So all the things that you were talking about, we have an uphill battle in Washington because the explaining job is really hard.
And they often say when you're explaining, you're losing, right? Because it means you're already being attacked. Another cliche I guess we could use is if you're not at the table, you're on the menu.
And we all saw this a little bit last year in Texas. Like, we were going up against the incumbent legacy data centers for the negative legislative cycle in Texas.
Yeah, to add on to that, which is the industry is finally maturing, and we are competing against traditional industry that has a significant amount of more resources. They have a very strong and entrenched network in different federal agencies, and it's incumbent upon policy and government relations professionals to come into that space so that we can advocate for policies that are beneficial to us, and then to obviously stop ones, including the EIA that I think we might mention, which was a very successful show of force from our trade associations and then the larger publicly traded Bitcoin miners, where we saw government overreach, and we had hit an inflection point with coordination, collaboration, and resources that we were able to identify it and neutralize it in winning that case in the Fifth Circuit of Texas.
So I want to ask you a provocative question. You were warned. Should the government be able to tell you, if you have an energy-intensive business, what you can use your power for?
No?
You have to say more than no.
Yeah. I think you're entering dangerous territory if the government is determining who can and cannot use electricity, who can plug into an outlet and who can't. And that plays into the scarcity versus abundance argument. I think we've heard a lot about energy innovation in our space, about how Bitcoin mining is incentivizing more generation. I think we need to be striving towards an energy abundant future, and Bitcoin helps do that. It helps to make new generation projects financially viable, and on the consumption point, again, we're users of energy, but we're not users of scarce energy. So it's a bad idea to choose who can and can't plug in, but even if you believe it's a good idea, in order to preserve sort of the balance of supply and demand on energy grids, Bitcoin miners ain't your target. They're just, you're fishing in the wrong water.
Yeah, I would say I think no. There's clearly not a lot. There's clearly other people in the world who think otherwise than I do. And maybe I'll use the banking example. Like we've pushed banks to be functional utilities in our society. You can't have a small business without opening a bank account. You just can't live your life in America without having a bank account. But the government's basically telling banks that within the vectors of risk that they're supposed to be underwriting, that they can't underwrite business to digital asset companies, mining companies, or at least saying, if you do so, we're going to keep a really watchful eye on you.
Which actually brings,
I think that's right.
Yeah, that is, okay. That brings me to my next question for you, Tyler. How can banking and traditional finance touch and interact with Bitcoin?
From a fundamental asset perspective, in terms of holding it on its balance sheet, it's very minimal. In terms of operational banking, I think that we have limited, but it's still robust enough access to the banking system where it's not a prohibitive issue. I think the FDIC in their Q4 call report data, and last year they said there was 137 banks in the United States that were touching digital asset companies in some regard. If you think about that, that's a really small subfraction of the depository system in the United States. And is it enough? No. Is it the right amount right now? I think no too, but it's not a prohibitive in terms of being able to get a bank account from an operational perspective. If you think about our custody businesses in the United States, most of the big banks are the largest custodians. We have pretty much seen them be neutralized or not involved in the custody business in the United States. Even if you just look at the Bitcoin ETFs, there's no traditional banking enterprise that is a custodian serving as a custodian of record for the ETFs. Is that a problem for the industry? No, but would it be better if they were in the system? Absolutely.
I think just briefly what that speaks to in general, sort of high level, is just the overreach of government, in particular within the Biden administration, and the lack of progress that we've gotten on meaningful legislation. So if you think of the stablecoin bill and the market structure bill, you know, those both passed on bipartisan work out of the subcommittees. They've not gone to the House floor for a vote, but then in the Senate, you have efforts around Senator Warren's DOML bill, and then if some of you have read the draft of Senator Tillis, his legislation that is, you know, the opposite of this, and because there's been no compromise and these bills have not moved forward, you have agencies that have, I think, taking approaches that are probably not constitutional, and it's something that we are actively engaged at, not just tracking, but actively fighting, whether that's on the financial side or on the energy side.
Okay, let's flip over to 2024. What do you think is policy-wise your focus for mining, both federal and state? Just a few things.
Well, fortunately on the state side, Texas is not in legislative session this year, so it's mostly just sort of the legwork to get to a better place than we were last session. On the federal side, I would say prevent bad things from happening. We have, in earnest, if you look at the floor schedules in the House and the Senate, it's like 6 weeks left this year because we're in election season. So I would say there's going to be maybe 2 or 3 big moving vehicles that usually are sort of the areas of opportunity to sidecar and tuck legislation in. I think there's a really narrow opportunity to have progressive policy for our sector, which may include bad things because it's always a trading game. But I think there's a low percentage chance, so prevent bad things from happening and hold the regulators accountable.
I'd say the subjects, just taking your first topic first, in Texas, it's preparing for the session, dealing mostly with energy grid issues there. And then at the federal level, I'll agree with Tyler. I think there seems to be an appetite in the U.S. Senate to work on AML legislation, which some versions of it are livable, others are not, but it's making sure that the ones that are unworkable don't get attached to various must-pass bills. There's a lot of government funding that needs to happen. There's reauthorizations of agencies that need to happen, and I think there will be some efforts to attach new bills to those. So making sure that ones that are actually sort of helpful and clarifying get attached, and that some of the sort of poison pill ones do not.
I just think we need to be prepared for whatever the presidency is, whether it's another Biden term or if President Trump is reelected. I think many who've been in Washington understand that this is a long-term game. And even though the stablecoin and market structure bill will probably not pass this year, given that it's an election cycle, we need to be prepared and educate members not just on the appropriate subcommittees that have jurisdiction, but the wider House and Senate, so that we can be prepared in 2025 and beyond, given what the administration will look like, whether it's a D or an R.
So we heard some comments this morning from Senator Lummis and talking about pro-innovation in the U.S. It sounds to me, I mean, all of your answers were more on the defensive side than the proactive side. And maybe that's just because there's a smaller number of companies or there's just a limit to what you have. But is there a chance to reposition some of what you're doing as a more pro-innovation, pro-new energy infrastructure and try and move that along?
I think two things I'll mention from Marathon's perspective. One, on the heels of the CHIPS Act and investing in semiconductors, we made a significant investment in Ardyne, which is a U.S. manufacturing company of ASICs computers, focusing on U.S. technology within the Bitcoin mining sector. And then a second piece to this would be our work overseas. If you think of macro U.S. China competition, particularly in Africa, we have focused heavily on working with the U.S. Foreign Service, both from the Commerce Department and the State Department, working with these Foreign Service officers in country, helping to not only support U.S. business and innovation on the continent, but also to solve these energy challenges that that have arisen not just globally, but particularly in Africa with their large power generation, but not enough offtake.
Yeah, I agree with that. Well, and Marathon's doing great things, and Riot has just announced an investment in a company called Reformed Energy, which is taking municipal solid waste and converting it into power. And I think in the long term, you're going to see Bitcoin mining companies and energy companies working more closely together and becoming even more integral to our economy of the future. And that's where we're heading. In the meantime, I think we're going over some speed bumps, but going on offense regarding all the different problems that our industry can solve because of our flexibility is definitely where I think we're going to be in a couple of years. We've come so far in just the last couple of years already. I think the future is very bright. It's just it doesn't happen overnight. It'll take a little bit more education, a lot more shoe leather around Capitol Hill, and telling these positive stories.
I would agree with that. I would just say there's a big opportunity to proliferate the economic development message in Washington, and particularly around things like the opportunity zones and the investment in underserved areas.
Which actually leads right into my next question about, it's not just state and federal governments that you're dealing with. You're also dealing with local communities. So can you talk a bit about that experience and what actually you might need, to do moving forward?
Well, our experience was kind of tailor-made for this question, actually, and for explaining what Bitcoin mining is to a lot of policymakers, because our first facility in Rockdale, Texas, we're building another one in Corsicana, Texas right now, but the Rockdale story is really compelling because it was an old aluminum smelting plant that supplied most of the jobs. It was a company town of 5,000 people, and when that smelting plant closed down, there went the jobs. And so you can kind of picture in your head boarded up storefronts and tumbleweeds coming down the street. And then Riot Platforms came in. That infrastructure existed for this large facility. We were able to use it to build a very large Bitcoin mine and employ hundreds of people. And we have 600 employees across our facilities now. And that town has been kind of brought back to life. And we've brought tech jobs to that area and given people really great new opportunities. And they love working for us, and we love having them as employees. They're fantastic. It's a really cohesive and vibrant community. And so that kind of development is innate in the Bitcoin network, especially because we are chasing the cheapest energy. It tends to be in more rural areas, but with a lot of power capability. So we have those examples that we can illustrate really well, and when we can kind of tell the story and put faces on it and talk about some of our employees who are benefiting from it, it goes a long way with both state and federal officials.
Yeah, I would say we have a very similar story on a smaller scale in Dickens County, West Texas, and I'll leave it at this to just say there was a documentary that was recently produced about it, so check it out.
It's a really great video. And one thing I'll just add to this, which is miners need to do a very good job of articulating what the benefits are to the community. And so it's not just to the county commissioner or the commissioner's court or those public officials, but also to the residents that are around there. And it's something that we take very seriously at Marathon. And to Tyler's point, love the video that they just produced about the work that they're doing. And then we can leverage these case studies in Washington, D.C., because a lot of policymakers, both in the House and the Senate, are asking, well, how many jobs have you created? What are the tax benefits? What is the on-the-job training? That goes missed a lot of the time, putting a face to a name when we're up here in D.C. in the halls of Congress.
Actually, a relevant question I think we've heard recently, we got a chance to discuss it as well. If you are building a large facility like this and you're in a community that maybe doesn't know a lot about Bitcoin, but they're excited about economic development, like buy your hardware at the local hardware store and make friends with that guy. Like hire as many employees locally as you can. Hire your construction crews and your contractors locally and build a really strong relationship with them. And then they'll be the kinds of people who will show up to the public hearings if you have any kind of planning or zoning or tax abatement hearing or anything that you need to just function as a business. You then have a coalition and a cohesion in that community that's going to just make your business a lot more successful. And so I would encourage all of our colleagues across the industry to think in that way.
Sounds good. Okay, so I had asked these panelists what they would like to ask each other, and the most common question that came up with was, how can the industry collaborate more? Go.
It's time to build our coalition of voters. There's Bitcoiners are all over the country. They're all over the world, obviously. They're so passionate. We just need to galvanize them a little bit better and point them in the right direction. They're not necessarily your typical politically active person. Some of them are.
Some of them are.
But not everybody. But we can really, we can be a force for good if we have some cohesion and some direction. And so I think getting together to build something of a political operation that keeps our constituency informed and active and participating in campaigns and policy debates in a really meaningful way would go a long way. Lots of industries do it. Think of Emily's List or the NRA or Planned Parenthood or any other really powerful force in Washington that can galvanize millions of people to have their voice heard. We need that for Bitcoin. So I think that's the next step.
I 1,000% agree with that, and I think if you can turn 15, 20,000 voters in a state into single issue voters, or if you can curate them in that capacity, then you can speak effectively to either side of the aisle, which is really important. I think in Washington, just to answer, it goes back a little bit to the last question you asked, we need to organize better as an industry behind pushing and being progressive about single issues. It's really confusing to policymakers in Washington to hear no a bunch of times, and it's really confusing to them when they hear no in a variety of different ways and why. They just need to hear, yes, we're for X, and we're for X because of this reason, as a single message.
And I think we're at a saturation point with the amount of U.S. citizens who in some way hold crypto assets, and we're sort of at an inflection point of where being against crypto, there are no upsides to it. It will be a downside if you come and say, I just want to get rid of this industry, particularly when you think of the Bitcoin spot ETF. There's 70 million Americans approximately that own some crypto asset. That number is only going to go up, including now a lot of baby boomers who are going to have that in their 401k and retirement accounts. And when a politician comes up and says, well, I just want to get rid of this asset, and they're going to look in their retirement account and say, well, I'm going to vote you out. And so I'm looking, forward to moving forward with some of these initiatives with, my colleagues and peers.
So I have two unrelated questions. One is, you talked about partnerships with the local community, but think a little bit bigger, because policy sometimes makes strange bedfellows. Who might be your strange bedfellow going forward?
It's a great question. The first example in my head of strange bedfellows, just to use an example on Capitol Hill, would be like on the financial services, on the digital asset committee of Warren Davidson and Richie Torres. Now, Warren Davidson considers himself a very conservative Republican. I think Richie Torres is pretty far on the left side of the Democratic Party. They both believe in the promise of this technology and financial inclusion, self-custody, individual empowerment. Those are sort of nonpartisan, cross-partisan, fundamentally American values, and those guys see things very similarly in this space. So you're going to find a lot of that, though, because like you stated, Susan, at the beginning, the ownership of these assets is not a partisan issue. It's all it's Republican, Democrat, Independent, you name it, really believe in the promise of what we're doing.
Yeah, I would take it sort of in a higher level personally. Just I think the human rights arguments, the ability to own property digitally, I think the music industry are maybe not strange bedfellows, but they're bedfellows that we need to foster more relationships with in Washington, because those industries and those constituencies carry a lot of weight in Washington.
And then I would say the elephant in the room would be around progressives and climate change. So if you look at where COP28, which is the largest delegation of government leaders focused on climate change, where that was hosted, which was in the UAE, who's our partner and who's one of our big international partners. It's the Abu Dhabi government. They've given a stamp approval of this technology in their company with a 250 megawatt site. You look at some of the goals around methane mitigation for 2030, a lot of targets that international governments are trying to solve. Bitcoin mining technology, flared gas, landfills. If you talk about building out renewable energy, what technology supports that? Bitcoin mining technology. So eventually the narrative and the story, whether it's grassroots from the bottom up, or whether that's governments like the United Arab Emirates and others, will evangelize this technology. And I think eventually they'll catch on to the positive impacts that Bitcoin mining can have for the environment and climate change.
I'd just throw in power companies, including traditional oil and gas companies, because not just because we can help on the environmental issues that they're dealing with, but because we can monetize their wasted energy and do that together.
So maybe a program of tax incentives to further encourage the green infrastructure might be something interesting to look at. I don't have that up my sleeve. I'm just asking you that. Okay, the other question I want to ask you, because you talked about going into communities and some advice for communities, what have the communities taught you?
There's fantastic workforces, wonderful people, and great assets, land assets, energy assets, and human capital that are all over the country. If you're willing to engage and you're willing to take a risk on them, they will bet on you in return. I think that's probably the biggest lesson.
Also, we purchased a 250 megawatt site in Granbury, Texas, and I remember the first town hall meeting that I'd gone to with the county commissioner in Precinct 2, and some of the concerns about, a lot of them felt left behind, and that having industry come into these rural communities where a lot of businesses and a lot of industries have left, and they felt seen, which was really important takeaway from me.
I would just say that people are, in general, intellectually curious, and even though in some of these communities that you've seen mining facilities develop or flourish, it might be a little foreign to them, that people are innately intellectually curious. So they want to know what Bitcoin mining is. They want to understand what you're talking about. So I think that we've seen a little bit of that sort of evolution of people at a very local level, which is super interesting and encouraging. It's probably frustrating for myself and our colleagues when we're having DC-based conversations because of the incumbent forces that we have to deal with every day. But it's very refreshing to see that on a local level.
Truly a peer-to-peer on the local level. So now we're going to wrap up with one. I would like each of you to give me the takeaway that you would like this audience to have.
I'll go back to miners use energy. They incentivize more energy. They don't use scarce energy. And so I think targeting our industry saying we shouldn't use power, like I said, I think that's aiming at the wrong target. That's one of the biggest challenges we have now. So help us spread that gospel.
I would say we have to focus on a progressive policy outcome, and we have to be singularly focused on it so that we can deliver an outcome for the industry.
And I have mentioned this before, but you know, I think the tide is turning, not just from a climate change perspective, but also from a voter perspective. And we're seeing both U.S. citizens in the masses adopting crypto at the same time that the industry is maturing. And we're at a inflection point for, I think, positive things for years to come.
And I think that's it, all the time that we have, right? Okay, thank you.